Good evening. I'm really extremely pleased to be here in a function celebrating the achievements and the future of such a great educational institution. In his opening remarks, Andrei Malesevich mentioned a very good friend of mine who I think many of you may know, Bohdan Havrilation. In 2011, I became the chairman of the board of the World Academy of Art and Science, an organization founded in 1960 by very eminent intellectuals from many different countries, people like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, those who were responsible for the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb and lived to regret it, Nobel laureates, people like Buckminster Fuller, Margaret Mead. And we have been working for the last more than almost 60 years now, looking to try to resolve the pressing global challenges facing humanity today. And in 2012, Bohdan was elected to the board of the Academy, and I met him in his office in Geneva and got to know this remarkable man. 3 years later, he invited me and a group of the leadership of the Academy to Kiev for the first time, where he hosted with his foundation a conference on a very ambitious title, What Ukraine can gain and learn from the world, and most especially, what Ukraine can give to the world. And I'm sure many of you would agree that 1 year after the war started here, not many people were thinking about what Ukraine could give to the world, but certainly were looking for help from the rest of the world. And I later realized how much of a visionary Bohdan really was, not only in his work at the IIMD in Geneva or founding the IMI here, or in establishing his foundation in which he educated to the end of his life some 500 young educated Ukrainians, sent them overseas to see what was happening in other parts of the world, to see the best systems that were working in other parts of the world. And yet, he never gave up the idea that there's something that the world can learn from Ukraine. And I think he was very, very right. I had an opportunity, I don't know how many of you have ever had the opportunity to read his biography, his autobiography. If you haven't, I would recommend it. It's a fascinating tale, full of adventures, like when he had to escape the Nazi invasion as a young boy, and he escaped into Poland, finally ended up in Germany, ended up in a refugee camp. And one of the fascinating things I could never figure out, some Canadian aid workers were interviewing refugees to see what to do with them, and they offered Bohdan a job as a lumberjack in Canada. Now, in a country of people of good height, more than average height for Europeans, Bohdan was one of below average height for any country. And I once asked him, they really thought that you could be a lumberjack? And he said, perhaps they were thinking of conserving the forests by hiring me. Bohdan had a vision that I very much agree with, and that is the future of Ukraine is in the hands of the youth. The future of the world is going to be in the hands of the youth. And that's why education is so important. And I'd love to spend the rest of my time celebrating the greatness of our educational system, of the Academy here, and of eminent institutions we've worked with in my alma mater, UC Berkeley, and universities in Paris, in Rome, and other countries. But I'm afraid the truth is that the education we need for the future doesn't really exist today. We still have a system of higher education based on a model started about 1,000 years ago. That's 400 years before we had a printing press, where the only way to learn anything was to sit and listen to somebody who had the information, and if you really could read and write and talk and tell people things, you were almost a genius at that time. Now we've gone beyond the printing press and the newspaper and the radio and the television, and we've got the internet, and on my device, and all of you have on your device, more information available to us at our fingertips than any human being has ever had just 25 years ago. And yet, we still mostly follow the same system, the same model, as if we need to bring everybody together because there are only a few people who have the knowledge we need, and we need somebody to spoon-feed us and pass it on. Now, I'm talking generally. There are exceptions. There are new models of education and some very successful models of education coming up in the world. And I'm happy to say and hear, and I think many of you know it already, that there are some leading models in Ukraine itself, right here in Kiev. I was at Oxford a few weeks ago for a conference on educating for the future, and we had the director of education from the 4-2 school, École 4-2 in Paris. I understand you have a branch of that right here in Ukraine already, one of the first in the world, where they've really flipped the model, where the teachers, 7 faculty for 3,000 students. What is the teacher-student ratio there? 7 faculty, because they're not teachers. They're facilitators. The students are teaching not only themselves, but they're teaching each other. And this type of collaborative learning is one of the keys for the future. I come from Napa, California, where we're right at the northern edge of the Silicon Valley. And about 25 years ago, the city of Napa called together 20 of the top high-tech companies from Silicon Valley and said, we want to become part of the valley. We want you to come up here. We want to train the kind of students you want here. What should we be doing differently? And they got a lot of good practical advice. But the number one advice they got from these companies is, you know, this was in high school, you spend 12 years or more educating students to learn by themselves and compete with each other. And once they enter our companies, they almost never do anything alone. And the one most important skill they need is to cooperate and work with other people and work as teams. Why don't you change the model? And Napa did. They removed the traditional instruction. The teachers became facilitators. The students were broken up into groups of 4 who were learning together. And the results were so dramatic that now, 25 years later, the numbers keep going up, but the last time I looked, there were about 130 school districts in the US that are trying to imitate this model. I think we all know that education is the single most important invention that human beings have come up with. Education is the means by which we take the cumulative knowledge of the past from all the generations, all the centuries, from all over the world, and we try to pass it on to our youth so they don't have to reinvent the proverbial wheel. They can go on and do something more. They can go and do something different than we have done. They don't have to repeat all the mistakes that we've been making for generations. But the essence of that education is not information. The essence of that education is a knowledge that we get from experience. For want of a better word, we call it wisdom. To know how to use the information, to know how to make decisions, not to listen to a leader and follow the line, but to think independently, to think out of the box, to think creatively. I work in many different fields. I co-chair an international working group on human-centered economics. And this includes economists and social sciences from many different disciplines, from many different countries. And we're asking ourselves, what are we teaching our youth about economics? We are traditionally teaching, for 200 years, we taught economics as if it had nothing to do with the environment. Suddenly we woke up one day and found out that if you keep producing more and more and more without ignoring the environment, we'll have tremendous economic growth until it leads to catastrophe. We still teach economics as if the market system exists somehow independently of the political system, which is purely an illusion, which I think you're all very well aware of here, because everything is being debated publicly all the time. And I'm mentioning this not to get down on economists or on economics, to say we need to reinvent our educational system globally. I'm not speaking about Ukraine, globally. It's great that you have institutions that are winning awards in the West. But I would rather hope that in 5 or 10 years, you have Western institutions that are saying, we won the award in Ukraine. I've been invited for the last 3 years to address participants, most of you probably, or many of you at the Kiev International Economic Forum. It's a wonderful event. It's a great education for me. I learned from all the speakers. I think it's a wonderful way to go about creating awareness and thinking through and discussing the issues. This is real education. But I'm concerned, having seen and been involved in what happened after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that there's still that idea that the knowledge is over there somewhere, West, that all we need is to get the answers from the West. I felt very happy this year in coming to the forum that the first thing what the Prime Minister spoke about was not foreign investment, was not IMF. He talked about human capital, said the real driver for our development is the people of Ukraine. And I think that's absolutely the key, not just as a slogan, but how do we do that? How do we develop our human capital? Somebody said to me, you talk about educating them more and more. The more we educate them, the more they're leaving the country. This was one of the speakers at the conference. And I said, then let's ask ourselves, what kind of education are we giving? Are we giving our youth the education to be aware of their own potentials and awaken their aspiration to do something themselves? Or are we giving them a technical knowledge that can only be used by going and seeking a job somewhere else? I think the key to the migration of the Ukrainian youth, which is very large now, I'm sure it will come full cycle in the future. It's not something I worry about. I worked in India for many years, and I saw for decades how the brains were leaving the country, and now they've all been coming back and founding companies and bringing the foreign companies with them. I'm sure it will. But still, why should we wait decades? Why should we go through that? 1985, I did a study for the Prime Minister's office in India where the total Indian exports of software were $10 million. 10 million. Now it's closer to 150 billion. That's about 15,000 times. How can we abridge that process that took 25 years to 5 years or 7 years here? I think education is the key. If we want a more effective, viable, democratic society, again, I don't know any shortcut, but an education that really gets students not memorizing what they're told, not answering and giving the right answer. You know, on the objective test, there's always a right answer and a wrong answer. But in life, it's not so simple. In life, we have to balance many different things and find the right, unique balance at this moment in this situation. That's what effective business leaders or leaders in any thing do. But we're teaching a stereotyped, abstracted form of knowledge to the youth at a time when the world is changing so quickly and it's so complex that the greatest gift we can give them is the gift of learning to think for themselves rather than memorizing the right answer and giving it back. So I'm not looking for the day when Ukraine gets the #1 scores on the PISA tests and everything. In fact, if you talk to PISA, they know it themselves, and they're trying to change their rating system because they realize it's creating the wrong behavior. All over the world, universities, educational institutions are trying to match up to their scores when they know very well what the companies tell them, what the societies tell them. We want people who think. We want people who can solve problems. We want people who don't know the right answer, but who can find a better answer than the one we have today. So I think institutions like this, which is the oldest in the region, I understand, and which is at the highest level, they have a great accomplishment and also a great responsibility. And I would not minimize the challenge to that responsibility. It's a great challenge because if the rest of the world hasn't found the formula, what makes you think that we can? And I have an answer to that. I think you can because you must. And the problem that's there with the great institutions around the world is they don't have to. They don't have the pressure of a circumstance. They're proud of what they're doing. I talked to a professor, leading, well-known professor of economics at Yale University recently, and I said, you know, how do you handle the diversity of views that are there in economics today? Because there are about 90 or 100 different economic theories in conflict with each other. He said, we don't have that problem in America. We all teach the same thing. Maybe he thought he had found a good solution. I was frightened. I was frightened by the idea that anybody thinks that the dogma that's being taught in the in the universities in America or in London is the answer for our future. If it has, why is our inequality shooting sky high? Why is our environment deteriorating? Why do we have such high levels of crime, violence, drug use, and everything else? Economics is about human welfare, well-being. So I think you have an opportunity here. It's a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is to do what nobody's done. And maybe that's what Bowden had in mind. He had a feeling. He knows the Ukrainian people. He knows you've gone back a long ways to your roots, and now you've regained your freedom and independence and are able to go to your cultural roots. And so you've got the resource, you've got to find that, not only for you. The rest of the world needs somebody who thinks differently, somebody who's not trying to catch up and to imitate, but somebody's trying to do something better than's done anywhere. And I believe that's possible. Back in 1984, I was doing research for a management book in the US, and we went into 20 of the top companies in the US, companies like Coca-Cola and Intel, and at that time IBM. We might not put them on the same list today. And the smallest company that we went into at that time was Apple Computers. Apple was a mere $2 billion, 7-year-old company. And at the end of our research, my co-author, who was the president of American Management Association International Division, he asked me, if you had to invest your money for the future in any one of these top companies that we went into, which one would it be? I thought for a few minutes, and I said it would be Apple. Apple, he said. 6 months later, the board of Apple fired Steve Jobs, threw him out. And over the next 10 years, the revenues of the company and market of the share of the company, even in the US, declined continuously. And my co-author called me up after they fired Jobs, and he said, "You still want to keep to that prognosis that Apple is the one with the best future?" I said, "Well, you've certainly thrown a serious problem at me." 10 years later, when Jobs came back to Apple as the CEO in '96, the press approached Michael Dell, who was at that time the founder, chairman of the biggest PC company in the world, and they asked Michael Dell, "What's your advice to Steve Jobs going back to Apple now that their market share has gone from 15% to 5%? He says, "My advice to Jobs is liquidate all the assets of the company and return the value to the shareholders because Apple doesn't have a chance in the world." And the rest is history, and we know what it is. The company went on to become the most valuable company in the history of the world. And I don't think it was just a mistake. I think the genius that was there was not just of a unique individual. I think he was somebody who was in tune with the rising aspirations of the society, the deeper needs of the society to make a technology that doesn't replace us, but improve, that enriches our life, that gives us a sense of mastery and empowerment that we don't have before. That was the vision of Apple in the 1980s. So if somebody asks me about the future of Ukraine, I'm not going to look at the financial statements. I'm not going to look at the foreign debt and the debt repayment burden or the income tax or anything. I look at something deeper. I think something that Bodenhav saw in the spirit of this country. And I'm very sure and confident that if that's what you look at rather than what's going on overseas, then like Apple, people will turn around and wonder, what happened to this country that was so much struggling and has changed so dramatically and has become a leader in a short period of time? That's my conviction, and that's my deepest hope and prayer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you much for your inspirational speech. And actually, you know, there are several reactions to what you said. I completely agree that qualifications, human skills are way more important, you know, than just mechanical transfer of the body of knowledge. And Kyiv-Mogil Academy actually is very proud that we have statistical evidence that we are the leading university in this regard. In my presentation, I mentioned actually that this is the second year that the government introduced tests, admission tests to the law master's level program. And one of this actually parts of this test, this is decision-making skills. And our actually graduates of the bachelor law program passed this test, you know, with flying colors. So we are trying to do what you just said. And one more important thing, actually. You touch on a very crucially important subject, actually, about brain drain from Ukraine. And this is a huge problem, actually, for our country, because every year, thousands of qualified, educated young people live in Ukraine, look for their future in the Western countries. And it's a problem. And actually, somebody, so not just one, quite a few people accuse Kyiv-Mogil Academy that we contribute, in effect, to this brain drain. Why? Because we prepare our students that well for them it's not an issue, not a problem to get a job in Western countries, to get entry to the PhD program and so on. But somebody said you have to prepare your students worse than, you know, you do it now. No, we are not going to do that. And we do perfectly realize that, you know, this is currently an issue, but you give an example of India. There is another example of South Korea, when, you know, in the time of instability, many people were leaving their country, but now South Korea does not have this issue. And actually, it's still an issue for India, but not like the 10, 15 years ago. People are staying in India, people are coming back with Western education to India. I hope very much that our students, our graduates will get back to Ukraine, and even some of them who stayed there will keep in Ukraine in touch and help Kyiv-Mogila Academy if we're talking about Kyiv-Mogila graduates. Several years, thank you for inspirational speech, really, it was great. Several years ago, we had 400th anniversary of Kyiv-Mogila Academy, and National Bank minted a memorable coin to commemorate 400th anniversary. It's my great pleasure to present you this small token of our appreciation for your great contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.